What I'm going to attempt to do in this video is explain the entire marriage-based adjustment of status process from start to finish, and I'm going to try to do it in around 10 minutes. I obviously don't know how long this video is before I finished making it and editing it, but you, the viewer, can just look at the timestamp and see if I was successful. I doubt I will be. But anyway, let's get started. So you are the immigrant spouse. You entered the US legally with some sort of visa, or you were subsequently paroled into the United States. And now you marry a US citizen. What does the process look like? Well, let's just start by assuming you guys have been together for a while, you've been sharing your lives together for a while, maybe you've even been living together for a while, which would actually be ideal for immigration purposes. And now you guys have decided to take the leap, get married, and apply for the marriage-based green card. There's a couple things you need right off the bat. First of all, let's talk about the immigration forms. The bare minimum forms that you're gonna need to file in this type of case are Form I-130, I-130A, I-485, and the I-864. These are the bare minimum forms that you need to file. Additionally, there are a couple optional forms. The two main ones are going to be the I-765, which is the work permit, and the I-131, which is advanced parole, permission to travel internationally. I actually don't recommend people apply for advanced parole right now in 2026 because it's probably a waste of $630 at the very least, but at the very most, it also probably won't get approved in a timely fashion where it's useful. And even if it does, traveling with it internationally is super risky right now because customs officers have the discretion to deny your re-entry for almost any reason, and you would have no real recourse if that happened, and we'd probably have to transfer your case to a consulate abroad where you might be subject to all sorts of consequences depending on whether you had been unlawfully present or overstayed your previous immigration status in the US or had other immigration violations. These could all become issues if we have to transfer your case to a consulate abroad. Not something you want to deal with, especially if your goal is to live in the United States long term. One key point I want to make about additional forms before I move on to the next part of the video: USCIS no longer accepts personal checks or money orders. You should file your government filing fees using the credit card or debit card ACH authorization forms. I personally strongly recommend using the ACH authorization form because I've seen a lot of people's applications and entire packages get rejected by USCIS because your credit card company flagged the transaction as a fraudulent transaction. And when that happens, you oftentimes don't find out for a while. And your package that you mailed to USCIS won't come back to you, won't be mailed back to you. You won't physically receive it in your mailbox for like 2.5 months after you mail it out. So you just wasted 2.5 months. It could have been avoided if you just filed it with the ACH debit authorization form instead of the credit card authorization form. And when you file these authorization forms for payments, you should file a separate authorization form for each application. The I-130, which is going to be mailed in the paper version, not filed electronically with this package, is going to cost $675. The I-485, which is the green card application, is going to cost $1,440 for an adult in most situations. And then the affidavit of support has no filing fee. The work permit, which I do recommend applying for, costs an extra $260. So if you do this whole package and you include the work permit but not the advanced parole, your filing fees are going to be around $2,375 payable to the Department of Homeland Security. If you're hiring an attorney, there's also going to be a hefty attorney fee on top of that, most likely, for the attorney to handle everything from start to finish. And by the way, guys, this is something my office handles. We can either consult with you to explain how to do it yourself, or if you're not sure, we can talk to you about us doing it for you and teach you how to do it yourself, or we can just handle the whole thing from start to finish. So if this is something you're interested in, you could always reach out to us by clicking the link in the video description below. So first of all, I recommend filing all these forms together in one big package at one time to USCIS. Along with these forms, you need to include a couple other things. Passport style photographs of the US citizen spouse, you're gonna need 2. Passport style photographs of the beneficiary, the immigrant receiving the immigration benefit, you're gonna need at least 4, and ideally 6 if you're also gonna include a work permit application. And you're also gonna need a medical examination for the immigrant spouse. If you just Google USCIS find a civil surgeon, it'll bring you to the USCIS website where you can put in your zip code and it'll list all of the civil surgeons that are capable of doing immigration medical exams. These are just private physicians' offices, oftentimes urgent care centers that make money on the side by doing these immigration medical exams. They all charge different fees for the exact same service. So I strongly recommend calling at least 2 or 3 that are closest to you and asking them, how much do you charge to do an immigration medical exam? And how quickly can you get me in for my initial appointment? If they tell you that we can't tell you how much it costs because it depends on what services you need, what they're referring to is that they might try to upcharge you for different vaccinations that you're deficient in, that you need to receive in order for them to certify the medical exam. So what you should ask is, how much is your base price, assuming I don't need any additional vaccinations, so that you have like an apples to apples comparison and you can compare the prices between different providers. A decent price point that I've seen these physicians' offices charge is like $400 or less. I've seen some charge over $1,000 for the same service. So if you're price sensitive, it would be a good idea to shop around a little bit. So once you have your medical exam and all your forms prepared, your passport style photographs, your filing fee, authorization forms are all ready to go, you need to put your package together. There's going to be some additional documents that you'll need to include. At a bare minimum, you need to include photocopies, not originals, of some of your original documents. The bare minimum is going to be your marriage certificate. And if either of you have previously been divorced, you'll also need to include copies of your divorce certificates to show that you're currently available to marry and that this marriage is legally valid. You'll also need proof that the immigrant, the beneficiary here, entered the US with inspection or parole. Oftentimes, that's going to be a copy of their visa that they used to enter the US, or entry stamp or parole authorization form that shows they legally entered or were subsequently paroled into the United States. You're also going to need to include the beneficiary's birth certificate or family record, depending on what country they're from. The rules on these vary from country to country, but 99% of applicants for permanent residence must submit their actual birth certificate, a photocopy, along with an English translation if it's not in English. That actually goes for any document you submit. If it's not in English or also in English, then you need to include a certified English translation of that document. You're also going to need to include the proof that the US citizen is in fact a US citizen. So if your US citizen spouse was born in the US, you can include a photocopy of their birth certificate. If they have a US passport, you can include a copy of that. If they are a naturalized citizen, you can include a photocopy of their certificate of naturalization. And you can include more than one of these documents to prove US citizenship. Now, when it comes to these original documents, remember that I said you must submit photocopies. If you submit originals, you're never getting them back. And 4 months later, when you have to attend your green card interview, the USCIS officer wants you to bring those original documents with you to the interview. And if you don't, they could deny the application and place you into removal proceedings if you don't otherwise have lawful immigration status. So do not submit original documents when you're mailing everything to the USCIS filing center. Another thing that you will almost always need to submit is the US citizen petitioning spouse's most recent tax return. There are some exceptions here. If they don't have a recent tax return for whatever reason, you might need a joint financial sponsor. This is a nuanced topic. It's a little bit too complicated for a short video, but if you want more information on how to do the affidavit of support or issues with the affidavit of support, I've put out other videos on this topic. You could always search my YouTube channel to see all the videos on affidavits of support. They're actually one of the more difficult parts of this entire immigration process, so it's something that you should definitely pay a lot of attention to if you plan to do it yourself. And the final thing that you guys need to submit, and arguably the most important, is evidence that you're in a good faith marriage. I've put out other videos on this, but generally things that USCIS likes to see is like a timeline of your relationship with photographs, ideally labeled photographs saying who's in the photo, where's the photo, what are you guys doing, when, things like that, just general descriptions, especially group photographs. It's important to indicate who is in the photograph so that the USCIS officer understands that your friends and family members know that you guys are married. It increases the chances that this is a good faith marriage and makes the interview easier both for you and for the immigration officer. Other things USCIS officers like to see is proof that you're commingling your finances, mixing your finances to some extent. you should be expected to answer questions about your financial situation. How does money work in your marriage? Who makes the money? Who spends the money? Which bank accounts do you guys use? Which credit cards do you guys use? What do you use these different accounts for? What money do you guys keep separately from these accounts and why? These are common questions that come up during the interview. Other things that immigration officers like to see include proof that you're living together. This is a big one. If you guys are not living together, you should expect some heightened scrutiny during your interview. You would need a good explanation for why you're not living together. An example of a good explanation is one spouse is in college and is living on campus, and the other spouse isn't living on campus or is living nearby, or whatever the situation may be. If you go to see each other during weekends, but you have a plan for moving in together in the near future, that would be acceptable. It's really fact specific. I've had a couple clients in the last year who weren't living together. Their green card applications did get approved. One of them had a really hard time, and after the interview received a request for evidence. We were able to satisfy it, and then she got her green card approved a few weeks ago. So it is doable, but it's more complicated if you guys aren't living together. And there are many times where I consult with people and I say, you should wait. You shouldn't file this application now because you guys aren't living together and your other evidence isn't super strong. So wait until you've been living together for a few months, bolster your evidence, and then file. Because if you file it now to try to speed things along and get your green card sooner, but if the officer is not convinced that you're in a good faith marriage, you might try to speed things along and end up causing a 1.5 year delay when the officer is not convinced that you're really married and flags the case for fraud and schedules another interview and like a home visit. Just makes it more complicated, actually makes it take longer when you submit it without enough evidence if the officer is not convinced that your marriage is in good faith. Okay, so we have a thick package with all the forms, all the supporting evidence, all the documents that we want immigration to consider. The only original documents we're submitting here is your original sealed medical examination and the passport style photographs. Every other document is going to be a photocopy or something that's printed on regular printer paper. No original birth certificates, no passports, nothing like that. No marriage certificates, everything's a photocopy. So you file it, and about 2 to 3 weeks later, if everything goes well, USCIS will issue receipt notices. You'll typically receive at least 2 receipt notices, one for the I-130 family petition, one for the green card application, the I-485. If you also applied for a work permit, you'll get one for that. If you also applied for advanced parole, you'll get one for that. You will not receive anything for the I-130A, which is considered to be a part of the I-130 for spouse petitions, or for the I-864 affidavit of support. After you receive these things, maybe like a month later, the immigrant's spouse will receive a biometrics appointment notice. Occasionally, the US citizen spouse will also receive a biometrics appointment notice. That's a red flag. That usually means there's something in the system showing that the US citizen has serious criminal history that might get flagged under the Adam-Walsh Act. For example, sex offenses against children would get flagged under the Adam-Walsh Act, and you may not be eligible to petition for an immigrant family member if you've been convicted of such an offense. Pretty rare in my experience, but it has come up a few times. After the immigrant spouse goes for the biometrics appointment notice, they take your photograph. That's actually the photograph that's going to be used on your work permit and green card, not the passport style photographs that you mailed in. They're going to take your fingerprints and photograph at the biometrics appointment. The risk of getting detained at the biometrics appointment is incredibly low. We've seen it happen a few times. Typically, it's more likely if you have an old deportation order that hasn't been resolved, in which case you probably shouldn't be applying for adjustment of status, unless there's a rare situation. There are some exceptions here, but generally speaking, you shouldn't be applying because when you show up to the interview, they're gonna probably detain you if you have an old removal order, unless you're protected with something like DACA or something like that. A topic for a different video beyond the scope of this video. Biometrics appointments are usually pretty safe, usually 10 minutes. They take your fingerprints to run your background check and your photograph. And then they continue processing your application. Typically around the 3-month mark under current policy timelines, you receive your interview appointment notice. And then if you're one of my clients at that point, we would immediately meet to prepare for the interview, which is gonna probably be like a month to a month and a half later. I've heard some attorneys reporting recently that the gap between when you receive the interview appointment notice and the actual interview is shrinking. One attorney recently reported that that gap was only 3 weeks, so they received the interview notice and they only had 3 weeks to prepare. Still more than enough time to prepare. And at that point, you really need to get your original documents together. And then that several month gap from when you filed the paperwork to your interview, you should also fill in that gap with additional evidence of your marriage. You know, that might be a 4-month gap, 4 more months of bank statements, 4 more months of photographs. If you guys have additional insurance documents or a new lease agreement or anything else that's related to the bona fides of your marriage, you would bring those to the interview. When you show up to the interview, these interviews typically last ballpark like 30 to 45 minutes. Typically the first like 20-ish, it could be longer, 20 to 30 minutes is just questions about your marriage. Is this a good faith marriage? Did you guys bring evidence? Can you answer questions about your day-to-day lives together? I've done other videos on what you should expect at the interview. It's beyond the scope of today's video. But after that, they will then shift to just the immigrant, the beneficiary who's applying for the green card, and they'll ask a few questions from his or her green card application. And then usually right after that, the officer says, okay, the interview is over. We cannot make a decision for up to 120 days. Please leave. And then they escort you out of the interview room. Usually within a couple days or a week or so, we receive an approval notice. It can take longer. It can truly take up to 120 days sometimes. So don't freak out if it doesn't happen in the first week or so. But if it doesn't happen within like 120 days, something's probably going on. Your case may have been flagged for fraud. You might expect a home visit at some point for an immigration officer to see are both spouses actually living here. The prevalence of home visits has been increasing recently. A bunch of our clients have received home visits in this context and a different context, which I'm gonna discuss in another video that I'm posting this week. So it's not unusual for that to happen, but it is statistically unlikely. For the majority of people, you'll receive your conditional resident card, the green card, in the mail several weeks after the interview. It'll be conditional, which means it expires in 2 years if on the date your permanent residence was approved, you were married for less than 2 years. So if you got married in January 2025 and your green card gets approved in January 2026, it's gonna be conditional because your marriage was less than 2 years old on the date that your green card got approved. And what conditional means is that 2 years later, your green card will expire, and before it expires, you have to file additional paperwork with more evidence of your marriage to remove the conditions on your residency. And then 1 year after that, at the 3-year mark, you can typically apply for US citizenship if you're still living together and in a good faith marriage with your US citizen spouse. All right, guys, that's basically the timeline for what you should expect. Cases are processing pretty quickly now. When you do it correctly, like start to finish could easily be 4 to 5 months, which is a good thing for people who are in a good faith marriage and don't have any other immigration issues to worry about. They're getting their immigration benefits faster. One quick note before I end. If you are out of status and your green card application gets denied for any reason, you are very likely to be placed into removal proceedings. So just something to consider when you're trying to figure out what risks are acceptable before you apply for immigration benefits. All right, guys, that's the end of today's video. If you have any questions, you could always schedule a consultation directly with me, Puyan Darian. I'm an immigration attorney handling marriage-based green cards and deportation defense nationwide. The first step would be to click the link in the video description to schedule a consultation, or give my office a call if you have any questions and you want to schedule a consultation over the phone. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time for another video.